Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Kenyan troops to deploy for Haiti mission. The Haitian capital has been gripped by chaos as armed militants run rampant across the city following months of delays thanks to an abrupt transition of power in the Caribbean nation. Kenyan security forces are finally set to leave for Haiti in an effort to quell ongoing unrest. Around 1,000 soldiers will arrive over the coming weeks to crack down on spiraling gang violence. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, A Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. But there's a new one in the finest bookstores in your area, and it is entitled, sir,
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
That is Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, welcome back. Before we get your take on the now reports that so-called security forces are on their way, the story that broke late yesterday about Julian Assange and on his way to freedom, your thoughts? What first came to your mind when you heard the story that Julian Assange had left Belmarsh prison?
Well, first of all, it's long overdue. Julian Assange is publishing documents like a newspaper publisher or a journalist. He never should have been forced into prison. And what is frightening is that he may not be able to pursue that line of work back in his home country of Australia. It's also rather curious that he is pleading, perhaps as we speak, in the Marianas Islands, a U.S. colony in the South Pacific. And the only good news about that is that it brings that beleaguered, beset colony into the global spotlight.
And it's also an irony that the newspapers that are now reporting his march towards freedom, many of them published the very things that he was accused of, the very national security secrets that he was accused of having exposed.
But it's things that I haven't. And of course, I take it that's a veiled reference to organs like the New York Times, for example, the Guardian of London, for example. Mr. Assange's reputation has been dragged through the mud. He has suffered unduly, and I wish him only the best.
Kenyan troops, according to antiwar.com, are ready to be deployed for their, quote, mission in Haiti. And, you know, Wilmer and I were talking about just before the show in Kenya, there are protests that the police have, used live ammunition, killed a number of protesters. And what are they protesting? They're protesting increased taxes because of massive debts owed to the West. Your thoughts on all of this, Dr. Horne?
Well, yes. Significant protests, and in fact, justifiable protests, because the parliament that enacted this new revenue is one of the most grossly overpaid parliaments on planet Earth in a country that has more than its share of poor people. And then, of course, the taxes have been proposed with regard to sanitary products, with regard to nappies or diapers. And the latest news is that the U.S. ambassador to Kenya, I'm thinking of Meg Whitman, a former leader of eBay, a former titan of Silicon Valley, has the ear of President Ruto and is largely seen, believe it or not, as a power behind the throne. Recall that it was not so long ago that she spent millions from her fortune. And of course, she's one of the richest women in the United States in a failed attempt to become governor of California. But I guess she was not able to exercise her thirst for power, and now she's exercising power in Nairobi. I should also say that Mr. Ruto, who was just in Washington, recall on a state visit, quite rare for an African head of state, has basically taken on the mantle of deputy sheriff for U.S. imperialism, not only with regard to Haiti, but with regard to the crisis in Sudan and South Sudan, the crisis in Somalia. He has been known to interfere in the internal affairs of Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. But the larger news that your listeners should focus on is that as we speak, the Africa Command, the notorious AFRICOM, headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, is meeting in Botswana in southern Africa. Recall that originally AFRICOM wanted to establish its headquarters in Botswana, but in 2007, then South African President Thabo Mbeki objected stridently and strenuously, and of course he was gone by 2008, coincidentally enough, and therefore AFRICOM repositioned in West Germany. But recall that in 2023, 43 African nations met in Rome, summoned by AFRICOM. Only 30 are now meeting in Botswana as we speak, perhaps because the shopping in Rome is more lush than the shopping in Gaborone, the capital of Botswana. But in any case, it's remarkable that the leader of AFRICOM happens to be an African-American, Michael Langley, and he joins this troika who leads the U.S. military. Remarkably enough, I'm speaking of Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown. And this is remarkable because recall that the United States Supreme Court sought to overthrow affirmative action. There's an ongoing and widening campaign against so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion, an attempt to purge Black people in particular from their post and purchase in U.S. society. But of course, the Supreme Court carved out an exception with regard to the military. And I think that reflects a general crisis of U.S. imperialism because with this talk about resuming the draft, and this time including women, which has been gripping Washington in recent days and weeks, it bespeaks this crisis of the U.S. military, the mailed fist of U.S. imperialism, and therefore they cannot afford to oust these Black leaders altogether. And as well, speaking of the crisis of imperialism, the United States is trying to make up for the shortfall, driven by the fact that France is in retreat from its former positions on the African continent, in forced retreat because we know that Niger, amongst other nations, demanded that France evacuate sooner rather than later. The United States is, of course, trying to fill the vacuum, but of course, it too was ousted from Niger. And therefore, you see the need for these African deputy sheriffs. Not only Kenya with regard to East Africa, but Zambia in Southern Africa. It, of course, has pride of place in the meeting in Botswana, Gaborone, as we speak. Recall that Vice President Kamala Harris made a trip to Lusaka, Zambia, not so long ago. Recall that just a few days ago, the president of Zimbabwe being in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism, was caught on a hot mic in St. Petersburg, Russia, at the International Economic Forum, speaking to President Putin about the malignant role that Zambia is playing on the continent and in the sub-region. And recall as well that Zambia is copper-rich and therefore is slated to play a key role in the green economy as organized by U.S. imperialism. And it's not only Kenya and Zambia. Of course, you have to look in the west of Africa towards Cote d'Ivoire, a reliable French puppet, not to mention the giant of the continent, speaking of Nigeria, which about a year or so ago seemed to be on the verge of invading Niger after a regime change there that Washington objected to. But it decided that that would be more than a notion, given the fact that Niger is being backed up by former French colonies, including Guinea-Conakry, Mali, Burkina Faso, and, of course, the aforementioned Niger. And so Washington is facing a real crisis. The Kenyan troops in Haiti is reflective of the crisis in the hemisphere. But more than that, Kenya's role as a deputy sheriff on the African continent is highlighted by the prominent and preeminent role it's playing in Botswana at the meeting of the AFRICOM as we speak.
And to that point, General Michael Langley says, I'm pretty sure that some of the representation from West Africa will bring it up, Russia moving into some of the African countries, because they all have been affected by Russia's activities. That sounds more like a very, very, very self-serving point by by General Langley, because I haven't heard of African leaders complaining about Russia's involvement in their countries. At least Russia isn't going in and overthrowing their countries. I haven't heard African leaders complaining about China's economic involvement in their countries. China isn't going in there fomenting coups and overthrowing their government. So this, to your point about sheriffs, this sounds to be incredibly self-serving, and it's really a meeting of puppets, not allies.
Well, self-serving indeed. And of course, I should also mention that besides Zimbabwe being in the crosshairs, and of course, it was not extended an invitation, perhaps justifiably and understandably, to this AFRICOM meeting, since it's seen as an antagonist of AFRICOM. Also in the crosshairs, I'm afraid to say, is the continent's other giant, speaking of South Africa, which has stirred ire in Washington by dragging U.S. ally Israel before the International Court of Justice, by being a stalwart member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course South Africa, now joined by other African nations such as Egypt and Ethiopia, not to mention Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And of course, weakening South Africa is priority number one in Washington, and they established a mini victory just recently by compelling the African National Congress to take into a coalition government the neo-apartheid party, comprised heavily of settlers, speaking of the so-called Democratic Alliance, which basically means that they have a spy within the gates in Pretoria. And that is a very ominous signal that we're going to have to keep a very close eye on.
One other thing, Dr. Horne, and that is, I've been talking to some people in the Middle East recently, talking about the potential spread of the conflict if Israel attacks Lebanon, and many of them are convinced that there is a significant Muslim contingent, shall we say, community throughout Africa, and that the likelihood of a spread throughout the region won't just be in the region, that it's quite likely that there are people in the Muslim community in Africa that would threaten U.S. interests. Your thoughts?
Well, you need look no further than South Africa. It's well known that in Cape Town, in particular, the preeminent city at the southern tip of the continent, there is a substantial population of Muslim descent. Many of them, of course, are descendants of the enslaved brought from what used to be called the Dutch East Indies and the Malay Peninsula some centuries ago, and of course are still there. And the move by South Africa against Israel has to be understood in the context of the ANC trying to win the favor of those voters, which I think was not altogether unsuccessful. And it's not just South Africa. Nigeria, of course, has a very substantial population of Muslim descent. The aforementioned West African nations, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea-Conakry, even Cote d'Ivoire, have substantial Muslim populations as well. And so what we see is that U.S. imperialism is ensnared in countless and multiple contradictions from which there will be no easy escape.
And final question, if I may, in a couple of these articles that I've read about the AFRICOM meeting, they don't talk about BRICS, and of course, AFRICOM is a military organization. BRICS is an economic organization. But what really seems to be at play here is the U.S. using the often used methodology of military solutions to economic problems.
Well, that's the forte of U.S. imperialism, is it not? It's destined for disaster, it's destined for failure. And I dare say that this AFRICOM meeting in Botswana is fundamentally a waste of U.S. taxpayers' money. AFRICOM is designed to crash, which it will certainly do sooner rather than later.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.